New South Wales Labor government has struggled to sell its credibility for a long time now, going back even before the last election, which it won by default. But it's now in a state of siege, with Premier Morris Iemma struggling to survive. For the past week, the state's anti-corruption watchdog, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, has been hearing sensational evidence of sex, bribery and a cosy relationship between property developers and the Labor-dominated council in Wollongong on the state's south coast. But the growing fallout from the scandal has now engulfed some of the most senior cabinet ministers. The reverberations have even reached the federal sphere, with the Prime Minister also flagging the need for a general review of political donation laws. Deborah Cornwall reports.
It started as an inquiry into sex, bribes and con men in the sprawling steel city of Wollongong, a magnet for sea changers that's become a property developer's paradise.
A lot of these buildings that have been constructed in the last 4 to 5 years should never have been built. They're over height, they're over floor space ratio, they've broken a lot of our rules.
But after 11 months of back-to-back crises for the Iemma government, this latest investigation by the anti-corruption watchdog, the ICAC, has laid bare some of the grubby realities of how New South Wales Labor does business, especially when it comes to cosy relationships between property developers and Labor-controlled council.
Well, this string of buildings behind us during the last election had the local ALP members' posters, campaign posters, right along the fences, and it was fairly clear that there was a constant flow of funds from these developers straight into the ALP coffers.
Worse still for the government, this inquiry also has tentacles that reach right into the heart of the party machine and may yet claim the scalps of some of the state's most senior ministers.
Anyone who's found to have done the wrong thing, no matter who they are out. Their heads will roll. The only thing that will be destroyed in this will be the careers of those, no matter who they are, that are found to have done the wrong thing.
The first witness at the inquiry was Beth Morgan, a former town planner at the Wollongong Council, who's confessed to having affairs with 3 local property developers at the same time she was handling council approvals for their multi-million-dollar building developments, some of which went well over the council's height and size regulations. Beth Morgan gave evidence she'd regularly met with the developers, Frank Vella, Glenn Tabak and Michael Kalaris, at a local kebab shop known to the group as the Table of Knowledge.
At a time when the lodgement of relevant development applications were imminent, Mr Vella and Mr Tabak both commenced sexual relationships with Miss Morgan. In addition, it will be alleged that both provided her with substantial gifts and other benefits.
But the young town planner may well end up being a sideshow compared to the string of Wollongong councillors, staffers and Labor heavyweights who've now been dragged into the inquiry. In particular, Joe Shimoni, a former senior executive on the council and a Labor mate, whose sphere of influence stretches all the way to cabinet.
There's no ducking and weaving. There's an investigation before the ICAC, and that's the appropriate place for these matters to be determined.
In last year's election, he played a critical role, raising donations from developers for Tourism Minister Matt Brown. He's also campaigned for Police Minister David Campbell, a former mayor of Wollongong. But the inquiry seems to have stretched the friendship.
There was a period when I would have considered him to be a friend. Of late, that's become more of an acquaintance relationship.
But it's Shimoni's close relationship with the government's most scandal-prone minister, Joe Tripodi, that's causing the greatest heartache. The ICAC claims Joe Shimoni appears to have suspected investigators were looking at him last year, but he was forced to resign from the council under a cloud amid claims he'd sexually harassed several female staff. From there, he went straight into a $200,000 a year job with New South Wales Maritime, the department run by his friend, Minister Joe Tripodi.
Well, in New South Wales, we're not run by a government, we're run by a clique. That's to say a network of mates. Labor mates run this state.
In some ways, I think ICAC now is doing exactly what it was created to do, which is to try and change behaviours, change cultures, change approaches. It's not essentially about criminality, there may be some. It's really about what's acceptable behaviour in public life.
For now, the Premier is standing behind his minister after being assured he had no hand in Mr Shimoni's appointment.
If there's evidence that is contrary to what Mr Tripodi has said, then action will be taken against him on two grounds. One, because there's the finding, and two, because he would have lied.
Morris Iemma has promised to overhaul the rules for political donations, but critics say it's so entrenched in the culture it will be hard to shift.
Well, the enormous war chest raised by the Labor Party coming up to the last state election was about $24 million. Of that, $7 million came from developers. It was by far the largest single component came from developers. Now, they want a return for their dough. They didn't do it because they're charitable organisations or philanthropists.
Former Liberal State Premier Nick Greiner says after 13 years of stacking the public service with Labor Party friendlies and a ministry full of factional mates, the Iemma government has even bigger problems. What do you think's gone wrong with the Iemma government?
It is the case that New South Wales now is showing all the signs of what Graham Richardson kindly called whatever it takes. But it's also, of course, over the years managed to denude both the political government and the senior levels of the public service of almost all their talent. It's a bit hard to imagine that any really talented person wants to work in the executive levels of New South Wales government when there is a policy of basically just avoiding risk and achieving as little as possible.
With another week of the inquiry still to go, even Labor Party strategist Bruce Hawker admits this latest scandal has started to bite.
I think these are really tough times for the government. They're confronted with a scandal of significant proportions, and they're just going to have to ride that out. One of the big problems that occurs for any government when you have these sorts of problems is that you become very distracted by it, and it means that you don't focus on other day-to-day work responsibilities.
And yet they share a tea room, which means
Certainly, this is a time the government can't afford to be distracted. In the past week alone, a series of bureaucratic stuff-ups have created even more headaches in the state's ailing health and transport systems. And the unions are in revolt over the proposed sell-off of the state's power services. Meanwhile, former Aboriginal Affairs Minister Milton Orkopoulos is currently before a district court jury, charged with sex and drug offences involving underage boys.
The New South Wales Labor Party now is, I believe, in the death throes of a very long period of very, very ineffectual government. They've got problems appearing in virtually every major area of state government. I think it's not surprising that the cracks are opening very, very rapidly.
But with the next election not due to 2010, many believe it's far too early to be writing off the Iemma government just yet.
The government's real problem, I think, at the moment is ensuring that the sorts of things which people expect of state governments happen. That is, that the trains run an effective service, that the hospitals, and that the streets are reasonably safe to walk on. That's what state governments are judged by, and if they can deliver on those things in 3 years' time, then they've got a fair chance of being re-elected.
Deborah Cornwall with that report. The Rudd government has commissioned a defence white paper which could see a dramatic